is indeed a very ambitious and complex task to try and deal with black women in antiquity. One would therefore have to be extremely selective, and one would have to begin, as one indeed should begin, at the beginning. We now know, and this is accepted throughout the world, that man was born in Africa. That in itself is not an important fact. What is important and what is only very recently established is that not merely was man born in Africa, because there are many stages of man, but that modern man was born in Africa. That is the latest findings of two teams working quite apart from each other, quite independent of each other, arriving at the same conclusion using the best research tools we have available. About a year ago, on February the 6th, 1986, a team from Oxford of 11 doctors, mostly hematologists, announced in Nature magazine that they had found that the founding population of the modern world was born in Africa about 100 to 120,000 years ago. So there is a big distinction here. Please note, because man was born 3.5 million years ago. We're not talking about that, because even when I was going to graduate school, it was made quite clear to me that although man was born in Africa, man diverged. When he migrated into Europe and migrated into Asia, a divergence occurred at the Australopithecus level, or Homo erectus, etc., and that a more advanced, more evolved type developed in Europe and in Asia. And that this type then brought the life back to the backward type in Africa. So the fact that man was born in Africa is quite meaningless. What we know now is that not only the first stage, but the last stage of man occurred in Africa. And in fact, just a few months ago, the most revolutionary statement was made by a team in California, working, as I say, using DNA, human DNA, where it was established that that a black woman about 140,000 years ago is the mother of us all. That out of the womb of a black woman, they can now trace all human descendants on this planet. Now the question arises, how did this happen? I mean, not how did it start, because that we know, but how did the variations occur? How did black people become other types of people, Asiatic types, European types? When we go into Europe, in the early caves, which we call the Grimaldi type, we're not talking now of Neanderthal man and early Homo erectus, etc. We're now talking about the modern type, with the brain cave of the type, the species that now occupies the world today, regardless of their superficial color or morphological features, etc. Man is one. That we know for certain. But how did this change come about? There have been several theories about this, but it seems as from the archaeological evidence, from the skull evidence, from cave paintings, etc., that Europe is first occupied only by blacks. There are no Europeans in Europe. This does not occur until about 55,000 years ago. We have evidence then of something which is called the worm interstadial, in which Europe is partly covered by ice, very thick. This is not the normal temperate zone we occupy now. This is an extreme condition, an ice age, in which it seems that an albino type comes out of the black type. This albino type undergoes certain mutations. At first, what we have is a dropping of pigmentation, so that you have a pink human with African features.
We interrupt this tape to inform you that it is copyrighted. Therefore, if you have purchased it through anyone other than Dr. and Mrs. Van Sertima, then it was sold to you illegally. In order to report such pirating vendors or to buy additional tapes, please write to Legacies, 347 Felton Avenue, Highland Park, New Jersey, 08904. Thank you for your cooperation.
It begins to undergo changes where you have the narrowing of the nose, the thinning of the lips, and other kinds of slight morphological changes, so that you have the expansive facial type in the tropics and the contracted facial type in the ice. The reason for the dropping of pigmentation, it is suggested, because the screen the pigmentation screen, which is necessary where man was born, did not become necessary in the far north in the Ice Age. There, in fact, it became in the ice somewhat of a disadvantage because you could not get the photosynthesis of vitamin D with the very tangential and poor sunlight in the ice. Whereas the screen of pigmentation is critical for ultraviolet, to deal with ultraviolet radiation in the tropic and subtropical regions, it can become a disadvantage in the extreme ice age of that period, where the albino type, which would die in Africa very quickly, became a mutation that survived and in fact stabilized in the ice, so that you have black types persisting in various parts. Like for example, we were shocked to learn in the study African Presence in Early Europe that researchers show that when Eric the Red entered Greenland, he found black people. It's very astonishing because these are not migrants, late migrants. These are people who came into Europe from the very beginning, very, very early, about more than 55,000 years ago, because the change began to occur in certain parts of Europe 55,000 years ago. Why I start with this is because I want you to be aware that the researchers now establish that it is out of the womb of the black woman that the human population that now occupies this planet springs. Also to establish too that the Adam and Eve story in the Bible, while it has a certain symbolic truth and a certain poetic beauty, is not really in line with what we know in archaeology. And in fact, it led to problems. It led to two problems. First, that archaeologists began to look in Palestine for the first man, and then there was a search in Asia. The reason why the search spread to Asia for the first man and woman was because Asia seemed to have black types, very fair-skinned types like the European, as well as the Mongoloid type. Hence, since all the types seemed to appear in Asia, we thought for a while Asia was the cradle of mankind. Then we looked in Europe, and then there was the Piltdown forgery, which led people to believe that man was born in Europe. It is only within very recent times, with the work of Leakey and others, that we've established the cradle land of mankind to be in Africa. But it is only very, very recent, within the last year or two, that we've established that not only was it the cradle land of mankind, but it was the cradle land of modern mankind. The Adam and Eve story presents another problem, and that is the assumption that many people have come away reading that story, that man is superior, man is the first thought of God, and that woman is an afterthought. Woman comes out of the rib of man. Now this is not an attack, bear in mind, this is not an attack on the Bible, because the Bible has many incidents, many movements, many events which have been established in other chronicles and have been established by archaeological evidence. What it makes quite clear that in the beginnings of the world, you do not have any reliable witnesses where man is concerned. Man is making things up. Everyone is faced with the incredible mystery of the emergence of man. How could you have a man and a woman? How could it suddenly appear? And the question of God, it still becomes an enormous question. As a result, people had to make things up. And in patriarchal societies, such as the society which made this story up, it was very important to establish that God first made man and then he made woman, and that he made woman out of man, which is an absurdity since man comes out of woman and not the other way around. Now that in itself is a nice story, and it wouldn't trouble us so much if it did not lead to a justification, a social justification for treating women as inferior. It did lead to that. It's very important to note that, because often it is men who create these fictions which present enormous problems. For example, it took me a long time to realize that Muhammad had a very liberal view of women, and that it was only other types of Muslims who did not fully understand Muhammad who eventually entombed their women in such a way that women were treated almost like shadows. So one has to be very clear about the origins of these myths, because myths affect human behavior just as much as truth. Reality is has a powerful effect, obviously, in human behavior, but myth often has a far greater effect in human behavior than what is real. And these myths have to be explored and have to be understood in a certain context. The Adam and Eve story, therefore, is beautiful, and it tells you about the first man and the first woman, but it has no root in any archaeological truth. And in fact, it did in fact affect research. Now, there was a myth in Africa, in fact, which was the first great myth about man and woman, Isis and Osiris. Isis, the great woman, Osiris, the great black god. And Isis was the sister wife of Osiris. The myth had one value in that it established the equality, the divine equality of the male and female principle, the male and female figure. The myth of Isis and Osiris was very important. It was important in this respect that it established an equality between man and woman, something which was not to be observed in a total sense, because do not be idyllic about that. In Africa, woman was not always treated as an equal. It is that in the divine pantheon, the woman was equal to the man. Unlike in the Adam and Eve myth, there was no question about the equal stature of the woman. Hence, it made it easier, it made it possible for the respect for the woman, the deep respect for the woman to become very strong. And in fact, when you look at the structure in places like Ethiopia, out of which Egypt came, you find that the emphasis on the woman's power equal to that of the man was so powerful that even when men were in charge, even when men became kings, we find there are parallel dynasties of their sisters or wives, so that you find the man reigning, having some political or temporal power, and the woman becomes the divine, she's the divine wife or the divine sister, she's in charge of the spiritual capital, so that you would have the master of this capital and the mistress of the capital, perhaps residing at another place. Now this was not kept up completely when the Ethiopians extended themselves into Egypt. And before I start to deal with Egyptian princesses, Egyptian queens, etc., let me make quite clear that in the period I speak of, there is absolutely no question whatsoever as to the blackness of these queens. Now Egypt is not a black country today. Okay, Egypt has black people in it, but it's not a black country. It happens to be in Africa, but it is not culturally Africa. Egypt is ruled by Arabs. The Arab is not the type that was there at all in the time of the great pyramid building, in the time of the origin, the great dynasties of Egypt. When we speak of Egypt, we are speaking of classical Egypt. Now there's been a tremendous, violent and sustained controversy over the centuries about who were the Egyptians. But there is no question about it now, because in 1962, the Russians had just finished building the Aswan Dam, and it was to bring waters over parts of Nubia and a small part of Egypt. There was great fear that a lot of the treasures would be lost. And as a result, many teams rushed down from various parts of the world in order to perform major archaeological operations before the waters covered these parts. The American team was extremely lucky. It had gone down there under Keith Seal. Keith Seal, in fact, was a man who had no respect whatsoever for the theory of the Egyptians being black. In fact, he'd written a book, When Egypt Ruled the East, and in that book he put the black strictly in the evening of the Egyptian dynasty, the 25th dynasty, which is known as the Ethiopian dynasty. To his amazement, he was the man chosen by destiny to make the discovery that the black was not in the evening, but he was in the dawn of the Egyptian dynasties. The American team was just about to leave when they discovered an enormous cemetery, which they call Cemetery F. In this cemetery, they found 33 tombs. In these tombs, they found a vast amount of jewelry, stoneware vessels, and pottery. When these were created and brought back and carefully and meticulously studied over 16 years, they found to their astonishment that even before the first Egyptian dynasty, even before the first family of kings and queens in Egypt, there was a Nubian dynasty, there was a clearly black dynasty on the edge of the Sudan at a place called Kusta. This dynasty, this monarchy was known as Seti, the land of the bow. And there they found, looking closely at all of the stone-made vessels and pottery and stone incense burners, etc., that 12 black kings had reigned in the Middle East, which should really be called the Nile Valley, even before the first Egyptian king had sat upon the throne of Egypt. And there at Seti they found evidence of the falcon god Horus, which is the black son of the black woman Isis and the black man Osiris, or rather the black goddess Isis and the black god Osiris. They found Horus, the falcon god. They found the shape, the crown, with the unmistakable shape of the crown that was later to sit on the head of the Egyptian and Nubian kings. They found the palace terrex and the palace facades, and above all, and this is very important, they found the first major writing system, the hieroglyphs, which we thought to have been Egyptian in origin, being in use by black men and women on the edge of the Sudan in Seti, even before 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. Now there are dynasties in Egypt that are not African. That is what has led to a great deal of problem. Not only was it difficult to accept that black women and black men were responsible for the great achievements of Egypt, because by the time the history of Egypt started to be rewritten and to be re-examined and reassessed, the black figure in the world had been completely reduced. Therefore, it was difficult to understand how black people who seemed for a while to be asleep or paralyzed or shattered and scattered all over the face of the earth, reduced in every form, colonized, enslaved, how could they be responsible for anything major and significant that was to affect world civilization? Hence, it was impossible to think, it was difficult, if not impossible, to think that black people could be responsible for all this. Because the Egyptian thing was something absolutely incredible. Most of you are not aware of what they have recently discovered in ancient Egypt. Things that shock us completely. We have to reconsider the whole business of how much man knew before he fell from grace. Because we are finding things that we simply do not understand how they could have learned those things, because we are now catching up with some of them. And it was very important, therefore, since that Egypt, since that black world, its black women in particular, as I will tell you, were to leave such an impact, such a tremendous impact upon the Greek world, the first great European civilization. It was important, therefore, to deny the blackness of that civilization. And it is true, as I say, this is very confusing for some people, that there are dynasties that are not African. The African was attacked several times. It's not only in modern times. The Hyksos attacked Egypt in 1660 BC, and you find what they call the shepherd kings of Asia rushing across Egypt. And for about 150 to 200 years, there are no African pharaohs. Asiatic types are in charge. And then there are attacks after that by the Syrians. The Asiatics attack the Africans, and the Africans fight for about 1 century to hold the Asiatics at bay. The Asiatics captured the Jews having spent nearly half 1,000 years among the Egyptians, and the Jews are not a race, by the way, although at the moment the dominant Jew type is white. The Jew at that time was largely black. Not totally, but largely. You have different types constituting the Jew in Egypt, and when the Jew leaves Egypt, he is speaking Egyptian. That, when so close is the relationship between the Egyptian and the Jew, that even though the Egyptians did persecute the Jewish sect, not race, the Egyptian did persecute the Jewish sect. And it is understandable, therefore, for the Jews have developed a certain resentment against the Egyptians. But when the Jews are attacked by the Asiatic in 701 BC, who do you think goes to their rescue? The blacks of Nubia, under Taharqa, the Sudanese pharaoh, march into Jerusalem to protect the Jews against the armies of the Syrians. And this is recorded in the Bible. It is recorded also in the Chronicle of the Nubians. It is recorded also in the Chronicle of the Syrians, where the blacks appear on the battlefield under Taharqa and defeat the Asiatic. The Bible says a plague descended upon the Asiatic. It wasn't a plague, it was malaria, which the blacks had brought up from the south, and the Asiatics were decimated, and the blacks held the field, while the Jews under Hezekiah had been wavering whether to surrender or not. The blacks were able to rescue the Jews, their allies. Now, what emerges out of all this? Why is it so important to establish who were the Egyptians? We've established their language. Sheikh Antiquity did that with UNESCO, establishing the language of the Egyptians as African. And a great deal of evidence, agricultural evidence, linguistic evidence, script evidence, skeletal evidence, iconographic evidence, all of these have established that during the classical period, the period of great achievement, the Egyptian is black. Does not remain like that, because he's attacked again by the Romans, he's attacked by the Greeks. On the Alexandrian 320 BC, he's attacked by the Persians. 525 BC, on the Cambyses, he's attacked by the Romans just before and after Christ, the great Caesars. He's attacked by the Arabs around 640 AD, and it's the Arabs who now control Egypt. And he is so un-Egyptian, most of the Arabs, so unrelated to the treasures of early Egypt, so utterly unconnected, that it was through myself and Sheikh Antiquity, who died a year ago, it was through our work that the British were forced to return the splinters of the Sphinx nose, which Napoleon's army had shattered, to the Egyptians. The Egyptians would not move on it. I want to make that quite clear, because whenever one talks about Egypt and Egyptian queens and pharaohs, etc., most people say, why are you bringing that into African history? What does that have to do with it? Those early Egyptians were not black. So I want to make that quite clear. In the dynasties that I do speak of, and the figures that I do select here, and I'm not only dealing with the Egyptian and the Ethiopian, but those figures I do select are clearly black figures. Let us speak first of one of them which captures our attention in the Bible. She's known as the Queen of Sheba. We have real documented evidence on her other than in the Bible. She is recorded in the Kebra Negah. And it is clear that she was not just a beautiful black woman who Solomon fell in love with and gave a child Menelik. She was also a woman with great power, greater power we now know than Solomon. One of her merchants, just one, had 520 camels and 370 ships, just one. The head merchant had 520 camels and 370 ships. Her trade network extended far and wide, so that when Solomon paid tremendous attention to her when she visited, it wasn't just because of her beauty. There was a romantic relationship there. It led to a son. But it wasn't just out of respect for her beauty, it was out of respect also for her power. And when she returned, you find that she does a tremendous lot of building and a tremendous lot of trade. This is one of the distinguishing things about powerful black women. And perhaps it is true of women as a whole, with one exception in the record which I have studied, and I will deal with the exception in a moment. In the reigns of men, you have a tendency, if the men are very powerful and they're not defending themselves, men tend to expand. Women tend to build. You will find in most of the studies of the black queens that it's during their reign that most of the great temples are built, most of the trade networks are expanded. This is partly due to the fact, perhaps, that whereas men in early stages of the world had to go out and hunt and killed in order to bring food at home. Women reared the child. Women built and reared children. Hence you have a tendency in the cases of the black queens that we have researched, a tendency for trade networks to be expanded, for building projects to develop, whereas the only women who you see fighting wars are fighting revolutionary wars. We have examples like Tetisheri in the 17th dynasty. She kept fighting all her life, but what was she fighting about? She was fighting because there was an invader, the Hyksos. So she had to keep fighting a revolutionary war against the Hyksos. When you find other figures like Amos Nefertari, when eventually her husband Amos drove the Hyksos out, she presided over the rebuilding of the great sanctuaries and temples of Egypt. And you find, with the exception, as I say, of one unusual queen, Queen Judith. This is a black Jewess, a Falasha Jew, who is very anti-Christian. Something must have happened in her early life, but she was violently anti-Christian, and she attacked the Ethiopian dynasty, defeated it with her army, and fiercely held her ground for 40 years. That is the only case I do know in the long history that has been studied, and there may be other cases, but surely it's an isolate where you have a queen who pursues a vendetta so fiercely that she becomes a very aggressive, very powerful warrior dynast. Many people have spoken of this in connection with Queen Hatshepsut, but they do not understand the nature of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, by the way, was the most powerful black queen that ever existed. Nobody could challenge her. And she literally seized power because, in spite of the fact that in Ethiopia you have a tremendous balance, and this was retained throughout. Like, for example, after the Ethiopians retreated from Egypt under the shock of the Syrian armies, the Ethiopian queens maintained power greater than that of men. That was not the case in Egypt. The male priesthood kept fighting the power of the woman, so that you have constant battle between male and female for power. And you find that the Egyptian, some of the Egyptian male priesthood try to keep the women in their place. They try to say, well, look, if there is no male heir, yes, you can have a queen who will take charge, or if the guy is too young to reign, the queen takes charge, etc. So the queen become powers, but they become powers in the background. There are some queens, however, and I will deal with two of them, who became tremendous forces for half a century. One of these is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a woman who challenged the male priesthood, insisted that she had a right to rule as queen, and when they said, no, there are male heirs, you cannot be in charge, she says to them, I am a man, and she put on a beard, and she resisted them. Because if it was merely a question of symbol, she just put on the beard, and her war was against her male rivals, and she defeated them. She had no truck with that nonsense. She completely defeated all the men who challenged her. And for 50 years, she became a great power in the known world. For 50 years, she was able to extend the trade networks. She is the one who's extremely famous for the expedition to Punt. She was so powerful that, as I say, for 50 years, no one could really challenge her. Queen Tide, and I have made her the heroine of this book. She's on the cover. This is the one that I have the greatest respect for, because when she was only 13 years old, she married the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was 53. She bore him 4 sons. 3 of them are very famous: Akhenaten, Tut, Smenkhare. We all know King Tut, and we all know of Akhenaten. Akhenaten became the most powerful religious reformer. He insisted that you could only worship one God. Now that was not new. A lot of people misunderstand that. One God is not new in Africa. Okay, this business about the Africans worship many gods rather than one God, that is nonsense. The idea is that since God is the universe, which he is, you cannot worship the universe. You have to worship You have to find someone through whom you can make some kind of intercession. You have or to make intercession for you. You have to find some mediator. You can't talk to the universe. You can't talk to everything, which is God. So that is why people have prophets. That is why they have mediators. And in the African world, there were such things as natures or principles. These were not gods in themselves, but they were principles of or attributes of the great single God. So it wasn't Akhenaten who introduced the idea of one God. What Akhenaten did was to insist that you couldn't worship the other. You were not to get involved in the various principles and attributes of the one God, but you were to worship the one God at all. That was what was used, not the idea of one God. Because the supreme force runs right through the idea of one single supreme force, runs through all African religions. When I pray, I don't pray to God, I pray to Jesus. I can't conceive of God. It is utterly incomprehensible to me. Jesus I can conceive of. Here is the great power working through a man like me, flesh and blood at some time. And I can conceive of that and deal with that, but I can't deal with the universe. The universe is vast. It's utterly incomprehensible when you think about it, that a star burst in the next galaxy, and there are millions of galaxies, and just in the next galaxy, a star burst. 164,000 years ago, we only saw the flash a few weeks ago. So one cannot deal with that, and therefore it is important to understand that although we find different terms, different images, we are basically dealing with the same thing. So that all this nonsense where they're trying to say, well look, this is the African type religion versus they have all of these gods, etc. I studied voodoo in Haiti. I did my master's thesis on voodoo. And the thing that comes over very powerfully is the idea of a single supreme force interpenetrating various creatures at variable intensities. It's no different from the idea that dominates the Christian religion. That is why it was possible to put Jesus right next to the voodoo god. That was the one thing that one found in voodoo when one was in Haiti. Jesus was always on the altar. He was incorporated, and it was easy to incorporate him. All the major saints, Catholic saints, were incorporated. Now, what was unusual was that not the black goddesses, not just the black queens, but the black goddesses were worshipped not just in Africa, but in Europe. Europe, for example, worshipped several black women. Medea, for example, who helped Jason win the Golden Fleece, she was the daughter of Aeetes, a Colchian king who was black. You find Circe is represented, you could see her picture on a vase in this book. She is represented on Grecian vases as a black woman. Not just black ritually, but with African features. She is the woman who is the enchantress in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. You find that Andromeda, one of the most important figures, who marries Perseus. This is in the Proto-Greek period. Perseus is of Mycenae, and this is the Proto-Greek period, just before the great flowering of the Greek civilization. It entered into the Greek mythology. This is an Ethiopian woman. You find also the goddess of chastity is black, Artemis. The goddess of wisdom is a black woman, Minerva. So that you have embrace of the black woman. But the most powerful black goddess is Isis. Isis dominates both the African imagination as well as the European imagination. Every major country in Europe worships the black goddess Isis. Even Caligula, the Roman lunatic emperor, built a temple to Isis. And you find Isis worship extending right in even as far as the British Isles. Now, Queen T, as I say, and I come back to this queen, is my heroine because when she married her pharaoh at 13 and bore him sons, the figure that took me off into religion, Akhenaten, that was her son. And when Akhenaten ignored the defense of Egypt, it was Queen T who filled the place. When King Tut was a boy, and was too young to rule, it was Queen Tiye who filled the place. When her husband, Amenhotep III, began to wither with age, it was Queen Tiye who filled her place. For 50 years, filled his place. For 50 years, she became almost like a secretary of state. She became the great power of the Egyptian empire. Everything she did was taken great note of. And one of the things that was remarkable is that her aged husband worshipped her so completely that for the first time he absolutely insisted that the sculptures of the queen should be the same size as the king. So although he was about 3 times or 4 times older than his wife, her sculpture was made in the same size as his, in spite of the protest of the male priesthood. He wrote great poems to her. He built a whole lake. It's still there. To immortalize her, it's known as the Lake of Tiye, or the Lake of Tiye, as some people choose to call her. Everything she did was taken great note of. Throughout Egypt and Nubia, her earrings with tassels were copied. Her eyeshadow was copied. Her wigs, her hairdos were copied. Everything she did became a fashion. Every dress she wore had a fashion, so that her, with a tremendous gentleness, she was able to wield this fantastic power for half 100 years. The figure of Isis, the goddess, was to have lasting effects in Europe. Not only did the European respond to the gods and goddesses of the Egyptians when the Greeks invaded Egypt, but Isis remains to this day. Isis is the beginning of the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna runs through many parts of Europe. And even after at first it was represented as a black figure with broad features, later on these were rebuilt and had European features but still retained their blackness. And some people tried later on, when the prejudice against the black color became very powerful, people tried to argue, the reason why it is black is because it fell into fire, or because it's so old that soot collected on it and therefore it turned black. But this remained significant. What remained even more significant was Isis and Horus. The Black Madonna carried a child in her arms. Sometimes, even when the face of the Black Madonna was changed to European, the child remained African. And when Rome converted to Christianity, the Black Madonna and child, the black woman and her black son, was considered to be Mary and Jesus. Horus, by the way, was the Jesus, the first Christ, not Jesus, because Jesus is the last and perhaps the most important of the living Christ figures. But you have the Christ figure that exists before Jesus. Horus was considered to be the Christ figure among the blacks. The word Christ, in fact, is an African word, K-R-S-T. It's a word that comes out of the Egyptian meaning the anointed one. Just as Satan is an African word, it comes from Set. And when it was carried over in the distorted Adam and Eve myth, you have Satan, which is an Egyptian word. You have, therefore, this concept of the mother and the child, the black child. Christ himself was a mixture. So it seems from the coin that we find on the back of Justinian II, there we see the face of the European emperor, and on the other side is someone who looks very un-European, with woolly hair, bronze skin, and a Semitic nose. He has full lips, Semitic nose. He's obviously a mixture. He's a Jew, and you have both the black and the Semite thing in the Jesus figure that is first represented, the first physical representation of Jesus we have at that time. Later on, in the time of Michelangelo, Jesus is then modeled from European figures. Now that in itself, please let me note, there is no sin in representing a prophet or a god in your own image. What was unfortunate is that people began to take that as a literal truth. And that has curious effects, because one of the things I remember very vividly in my own country was the assumption that if God chose to represent himself as a white man, Therefore, God was white. Whereas God chose to represent himself as a man that contains all the races, because if you see that Christ figure, the Semite and the black, that would constitute a merging and a mixing of people. As Edward Kennedy said in a debate last year with the head of the moral majority, what is his name? Falwell, yes. What a perfect name. And he said to him, if Jesus had turned up in South Africa, he would be classified as black. So that you have this, it's very important to note this, that this Black Madonna is not something that is recent. It springs from that prototypic Isis figure that comes out of the black world. But moving away from the Egyptian and Ethiopian world, let us look at other parts of Africa. When we go into the very deep ancient heart of Africa, we find a number of astonishing things. We find various hairstyles which we thought to be recent, going back 5,000 years. We find the cornrow in the Sahara. Now there are drawings and paintings, we could see that. We've also found that very early, even before this starts to move into parts of Egypt, Ethiopia, parts of Greece, and therefore spread throughout Europe, we have introduces the staining of nails, toenails and fingernails. That begins in Africa. You find the use of lipstick, although lipstick at that time was confined to the concubines. You find a range of earrings and necklaces. Now, that was not to remain African in the world, but the first evidence we do have in archaeology, these earrings and necklaces we find in Africa. We find also Africans using pellets of sweet gum as a beauty thing, as breath fresheners. All of these things appear. And one of the things that struck me in the research was the discovery that the Africans came upon the vaccine during beautification operations, that they were puncturing the skin sometimes to create various tattoos, etc., for beautification and identification markings, and they fell upon the vaccine because they found that you could introduce a small body of antibodies against the disease by the use of this kind of thing, and eventually the vaccine was developed there. The vaccine, in fact, that was developed in Africa precedes Jenner's discovery of the vaccine by many hundreds of years. I don't want to get involved in that in my lectures on blacks in science. In the book Blacks in Science, I deal with the tremendous medical breakthroughs that were made in Africa that were not recognized, some of them affecting European medicine. The vaccine did not, because another vaccine was developed independently in Europe, but there are certain medical breakthroughs. But I mention this one because it came out of beautification things that were developed in Africa. Now, outside of Egypt and Ethiopia, as I say, there are other black queens that are very important. There are a vast range of them, but I picked two because they represent women who remain powerful and defiant in spirit in spite of colonization. One of these was Queen Nzinga of the Congo. Her story is a really very tragic but very inspiring story, because she fought the Portuguese. She became, when she was 41 years old, she became queen of a great part of the Congo in 1623, and she had to fight Portuguese colonization. And the Portuguese took her sister and beheaded her sister and sent the head floating down the river to terrify her. But she continued to fight to the bitter end. And even though she lost, she nevertheless charged her people with a great spirit of revolution. You find this also in another great queen, the queen of the Ashanti, Ya Asantewa. The British had fought the Ghanaians for 50 years. A lot of people assumed that Africans just went down like dominoes. Some of them did, because Africa was attacked during a very, very vulnerable period. Africa wasn't defeated simply because of some inferior technology, because when you study the record closely, and I must mention this even though I'm dealing with black women, because it bears heavily on the black problem and black history as a whole. The gun was not invented in Europe. The Russians have shown us manuscripts, Arabic manuscripts, where you see the Arabs using the fire stick for the first time against the Indians during the Muslim invasion. Gunpowder came out of China. Gunpowder was brought by the Moors out of China into Europe. The gun was brought by the Arabs into Europe. Europeans did not know of the fire stick, nor did they have gunpowder technology. That was introduced when the Arabs and Africans marched into Europe. It was introduced, in fact, during a black-dominated dynasty, the Almohade dynasty. Right? It is very important to note that, because most people are not aware of the profound impact of the African figure on European societies. What we are dominated by, what dominates our consciousness, is what happened over the last 5 centuries, as though that last chapter, significant though it is, that more immediate chapter seems to be the only chapter, and most blacks as well as whites come to think that their history is locked within that little chapter, that little room of time. One has to become aware of the profound influence of these things. And there are some Africans who fought to the bitter end. The Ghanaians fought the British for 50 years. The British had to take bombs and drop them on the cattle and slaughter the cattle before the Ghanaians surrendered. And when King Prempeh was exiled in 1896, 2 years later, the British, arrogant as ever, insisted that the Ghanaians should give up their golden stools. That was a great symbol of power and independence. And the Ghanaians were so cowed by the bombing and by the exile of their great king, they were willing to surrender. And the Queen Asantewaa got up, and I will read to you what she said. She said, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we, the women, will. We will fight the white men." And this so made the men so ashamed that they continued the struggle. They did lose. But the point was that even in that loss, a certain to have defied the power, to have lost with honor, meant they were able to retain something that was later to be of great advantage to them in modern times. The many figures that we have examined indicate to us that you have a long tradition of powerful queens in Africa. One of the things that have always been asked me, what was the woman, the ordinary woman, not just the royal woman, because what happened in the royal families, yes, it did affect ordinary people, because that is held up as an image and a model of the very best. What happened among the common people? There is such a profound ignorance about African family systems. I was to have opened the National Black Family Conference in Kentucky last Saturday. I was ill, so I was not able to do that. But one of the things that I wanted very much to say was that the role of the woman in African society is gravely misunderstood. It is assumed, for example, that in many of the West African societies where you have polygamous unions, the woman was just one of many, therefore she was not taken very seriously by the men. First of all, the polygamous relationship is gravely misunderstood. Not everybody could have several wives. Only very prosperous, very powerful, very independent men could have several wives. And the polygamous union is not just a sexual thing. The mother could be in the harem, the unwed sister, the brother who's, the woman whose husband had died, and the brother would take over, not necessarily sleeping with her. It was a social welfare institution. It protected unmarried women. It wasn't just a sexual institution. And the other thing was that ordinary men could not have several wives. They had to have something to offer those women. Those prosperous men, therefore, out of security and prosperity, like noblemen, could have several wives. And this was necessary in a certain period because it was necessary in agricultural societies often to have many children who would help work the land, which was a kind of mini-state in itself. One therefore has to understand the particular and peculiar circumstances under which these institutions develop. I say this because men in parts of the Americas have used this as an excuse for having plural wives. They use this as an excuse to say, well, look, this is so in Africa. When it springs out of totally different situations here, like in the Caribbean and in parts of America, where the man was cut away, cut asunder from his family and sent wandering from plantation to plantation. He would have a wife on each plantation as he wandered. In other words, whereas that plurality of wives grew out of prosperity and power, here it grew out of insecurity and lack of power. It's a totally different circumstance, and one has to understand it in that context. The woman, therefore, did not lose her dignity or her equality in the polygamous union, because in most polygamous unions, each woman had her own house. She had her own farm. She was queen of the soil. Many of these women became powerful and independent. They had their own market trade. It was true that the woman was closer to the child than the man, because if in a polygamous union the man had several wives, these children shared their father, whereas they only had one mother. So the link between the mother and the child was a deeper, stronger link, but the man's relationship with the family was not cut off, so that you do not have the absent man as you have in later situations here. You have a man who comes for a while and then goes, but he's not completely absent, nor is his authority absent from the family. I think this is very important, and the type of independence the woman acquired in the African situation, particularly in her economic independence, was something that had occurred even before she was brought here, and before the nature of the slave situation led to another kind of independence. So it's very important to note that. Why is all this information about the past important? People often ask, why does one delve in ancient history? Why does one go back into the past? Why is it so valuable for us to learn what really happened? First of all, it is important to understand that what happened 1,000 years ago or 10 minutes ago occupies the same space-time in consciousness. This is the universe. That star, which belonged to the nearby galaxy, exploded 164,000 years ago. Yet we can see it. We have actually photographed the moment of the explosion. Nothing in the universe is totally lost. We can still see things which have ceased to exist. What is very important to understand is that the universe of the mind, which is what we occupy. We don't just occupy present time. We pass through all the rooms of space and time. Our prejudices, our assumptions, our reflexes, our behavior is determined by what passes through this consciousness. We are ruled by our false notions of the past. A great deal of the assumptions about the black as a whole and the woman in particular is ruled by false notions of what happened in history. The assumption, for example, that women are inferior because they have smaller brains. This was used for a long time, until examination showed that when they started to look, they looked at 3 geniuses in Europe and found that they had smaller brains than the normal brain. That size of brain had nothing to do with intelligence. It was convolutions in the brain. And then they would start, then they found that they started another kind of falsehood. They said that white people, European people, had more convolutions in the brain, until it was pointed out that when they were making the comparison, the brains they picked up that were African or black were brains they got out of prisons and hospitals. So they would compare the worst or the lowest level intellectual type often with the highest level intellectual type in Europe. Now it has been established that there is no
the brain case we occupy is the same relatively in all races. Obviously, you're going to find individual differences, but the potential in each race is roughly the same. It is very important to note, therefore, that the potential in women is as great as the potential in men. Not because man has for a long time ruled the world, that women are inferior. We have to bear in mind, however, that equality does not mean sameness. One of the tragedies of the revolution of the woman in recent times is the assumption that she has to be the same in every respect. We are different. Males are different from females. So you can have an equality, but you also have complementarity. In other words, there are certain things that have to be redefined, yes. There are certain measures of independence that have to be acquired, yes. But we should not lose sight of the fact that a certain equality can be maintained without everybody becoming the same. Equality does not necessarily mean sameness. And it's important to realize the myths that have sustained that kind of inequality. Just as the black has lived under the shadow of the white ego, the female has often lived under the shadow of the male ego. We have got to look at history again in order to correct this. We have got to look at history again in order to realize that the falsehood, the myths that have dominated that history have locked us into fixed ways of seeing, feeling, and thinking, and that we cannot liberate ourselves from those fixed ways. We can never reconstruct the history of the world and provide a true and equal ground for the male and the female unless we look again at the past, a past that takes us out it opens up, it takes us out of the small cell and room of time in which we are locked and brings us out into the larger, more liberating house of history. Thank you very much.